It's never the gunshot that changes your life. It's the quiet sound right before it. A ticking gear, a drawn breath, a vibrating phone. She thought she was just an invisible clerk in a room full of dangerous men. Then her burner buzzed. She answered it, slipping effortlessly into a brutal, guttural dialect she had spent 10 years trying to bury. The room went dead silent. The man in the bespoke suit didn't draw a weapon. He just stared. The horology shop smelled of ozone-aged brass and the faint, sour tang of nervous sweat. Camille kept her head down, her focus pinned to the microscopic gears of a shattered 1960s Omega. The magnifying loop squeezed her eye socket, giving her a headache that throbbed in time with the dozen antique grandfather clocks lining the oak-paneled walls. She hated Thursdays. Thursdays were for the private clients. The ones who came in after the iron grills were pulled down over the street-facing windows. Across the glass counter stood Nicholas Valenti. He didn't look like the caricatures from the movies. He didn't wear excessive gold, and he didn't chew on cigars. He wore a charcoal wool suit that looked soft enough to sleep in, and he smelled faintly of bergamot and cold rain. But Camille knew what he was. She knew it by the way the two men flanking the door stood with their weight resting on the balls of their feet, hands hanging loosely by their sides, jackets unbuttoned despite the draft in the shop. She knew it by the suffocating drop in barometric pressure the moment he had stepped through the door. Nicolas picked up a vintage Patek Philippe. His fingers were long, the knuckles scarred with pale, jagged lines that contrasted sharply with the manicured nails. He didn't ask about the price. He just ran his thumb over the crystal. "The escapement was replaced," Camille said. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. She hated how breathless she sounded. "Last year. It's not original." Nicholas didn't look up. "I don't care if it's original. I care if it keeps time. It loses 4 seconds a month." "Acceptable." The transaction should have ended there. He would nod, one of the statues by the door would hand over a thick envelope of cash, and Camille could go back to the back room, take off her pinching heels, and eat her stale turkey sandwich in peace. Then her pocket vibrated. It wasn't her smartphone. It was the heavy plastic burner phone she kept tucked into the waistband of her skirt, pressing uncomfortably against her hip bone. She froze. The burner hadn't rung in 3 years. Only one person had the number, and if he was calling, someone was either dead or about to be. The vibration stopped. Then it started again, a frantic, continuous buzzing that seemed to rattle against her ribs. Nicholas finally looked up from the watch. His eyes were the color of dirty ice. "You should answer that." It wasn't a suggestion. Camille swallowed the dry lump in her throat. Her hands felt clumsy, her fingertips numb, as she fished the cheap plastic phone from her pocket. She turned her back to the counter, taking 2 steps toward the curtained doorway of the repair room. She pressed the green button and lifted it to her ear. "Yeah," she whispered. "Camilla, they found the ledger. It was her cousin Frankie." He was hyperventilating the words, tumbling out in a panicked rush of street slang. "I swear to God, I didn't say nothing but they're coming. You gotta get out. You gotta." Camille didn't think. Instinct buried under 10 years of quiet living, of pretending to be a nobody in a dusty clock shop snapped to the surface. The cynical, hardened girl who had grown up dodging blood money debts took over. "Shut your mouth," she hissed, but she didn't say it in English. She spoke in rapid, venomous Campanian. It wasn't the lyrical Italian taught in universities. It was the dirty, clipped dialect of the southern slums laced with regional curses that only insiders knew. "You burn the books, you burn the car. If you lead them to me, I'll bury you myself. Capisci?" She cut the call her chest, heaving the plastic phone, slick with sweat in her palm. For a second there was nothing but the relentless overlapping ticking of 100 clocks. Slowly Camille turned around. Nicholas Valenti was perfectly still. The vintage watch was resting on the velvet pad. His two men hadn't drawn weapons, but their postures had shifted. They were looking at Nicholas. Nicholas was looking only at her. The silence stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. He didn't yell. He didn't demand to know who she was. He just tilted his head, a microscopic movement, as if adjusting his vision to see her for the very first time. "Wrap it up," Nicholas said, softly, gesturing to the watch. He spoke English, but the cadence had shifted. It was heavier, deliberate. Camille's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the velvet box. She fumbled with the ribbon, her breath shallow. She slid the box across the glass. Nicholas didn't take it. He let one of his men step forward to retrieve it. "Have a good evening, Camille," Nicholas said. He walked out the door. The bell jingled cheerily, an absurd sound in the wake of the terror he left behind. The moment the deadbolt clicked into place, Camille collapsed against the heavy oak door. The wood was cold against her spine. She didn't feel like a badass. She didn't feel like a survivor. She felt completely and utterly sick. She scrambled to the cramped bathroom in the back, dropping to her knees in front of the stained porcelain sink. She dry-heaved violently, her stomach cramping, as she brought up nothing but acid and the lingering taste of morning coffee. The bathroom smelled of industrial bleach and cheap pine soap. It grounded her just a little. She turned on the faucet, splashing freezing water onto her face. The woman looking back at her in the flecked mirror was a stranger, pale, trembling with dark circles under wide, terrified eyes. "Stupid," she whispered. "Stupid, stupid, stupid. 10 years. 10 years of building a fake identity, of living in a terrible studio apartment, of meticulously filing taxes under a ghost's social security number. She had worked so hard to become boring, and she had thrown it all away because she lost her temper with an idiot cousin. Nicholas Valenti wasn't just a client. He was the head of the syndicates operating out of the harbour. And she had just spoken to him, or rather in front of him, in the exact dialect used by the rival families his cartel had been slaughtering for the past decade. She didn't know if he thought she was a spy, an assassin, or a rat. It didn't matter. Men like Nicholas didn't ask questions. They just tied up loose ends. Camille shoved her feet into her boots, not bothering to lace them properly. She grabbed her canvas tote bag, sweeping her wallet keys and a handful of loose cash from the register, till into it. She didn't care if the owner fired her. She wouldn't be in the city by tomorrow morning. She stepped out the back alley door. The rain had started a miserable icy drizzle that instantly soaked into the collar of her cheap wool coat. The alley smelled of wet garbage and rotting cardboard. She walked fast, her boots squelching on the greasy cobblestones. Every shadow looked like a man holding a gun. Every passing car sounded like an idling hearse. She didn't take the subway. It was a choke point. Instead, she walked the 40 blocks to her apartment, sticking to crowded streets, keeping her head down. The city lights smeared in the puddles, a chaotic blur of neon reds and sickly yellows. Her right heel had a blister that burst somewhere around 23rd Street, sending sharp spikes of pain up her calf with every step. She welcomed it. The pain meant she was alive. By the time she reached her building, she was shivering violently, her clothes plastered to her skin. The lobby smelled of boiled cabbage and old dust. The elevator was broken as always. She climbed 5 flights of stairs, her breath tearing through her throat, her keys already gripped between her knuckles like a makeshift weapon. She unlocked her door, slipped inside, and slammed it shut, throwing all 3 deadbolts. She leaned against it, panting in the dark. Silence. Just the hum of the ancient refrigerator. She flipped the light switch. The bulb flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over her miserable, cramped life. A mattress on the floor, a stack of milk crates serving as a dresser. She needed to pack. 5 minutes, then she was out. She dragged a duffel bag from under the bed. Her hands were still trembling, making her clumsy. She grabbed jeans, sweaters, rolling them haphazardly. Then she heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the sound of a heavy tread on the squeaky floorboard in the hallway, the one right outside her door. Camille froze, a pair of socks clutched in her fist. The blood roared in her ears. A shadow passed under the crack of her door. Someone was standing out there, waiting. 4 miles away in the plush, climate-controlled leather interior of a town car, Nicholas Valenti watched the rain streak down the tinted glass. Jazz, specifically Coltrane, played softly from the speakers. The smooth, weeping saxophone felt entirely at odds with the violence humming in the vehicle. In the passenger seat, his Lieutenant David was scrolling through a tablet. "Her name is Camille Hayes," David said, his voice flat. "Or at least that's what her W-2 says. Social Security number traces back to a deceased girl from Oregon. She's a ghost, boss." Nicholas didn't blink. He was still thinking about the way she had looked in the shop. A mousy little bird terrified of her own shadow, until that phone rang. Then the mask had slipped. The venom in her voice, the perfect, localized cadence of the Naples underworld. "She's not a ghost," Nicholas said softly. "She's a refugee." "You think she's working for the opposition?" Nicholas rubbed his thumb over the scar on his knuckle. "If she were a plant, she wouldn't have answered a burner in the middle of a transaction." She panicked. "She's hiding from them just as much as she's hiding from us." "So what do we do?" David asked. "Let her go." Nicholas closed his eyes. The memory of her terrified, defiant eyes flashed in his mind, the way she had gripped the glass counter. She was a liability. She was a thread that could unravel a war. By all logic, he should let his men sweep the apartment, tie a weight to her ankles, and let the harbor swallow her secrets. "Call Thomas," Nicholas said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register. "He's at her building." David dialed the number, put it on speaker. "Yeah." Thomas's voice came through, muffled by the rain. "I'm outside her door." "Don't breach," Nicholas ordered. The saxophone wailed a lonely note. "She's going to run. She's probably trying to find a way out right now. Cover the alley. We're taking her for a ride, boss." Nicholas looked out at the city, a cold, damp labyrinth. "No," he said, quietly. "Don't hurt her. But whatever you do, don't let her leave." Back in the apartment, Camille wasn't looking at the front door anymore. She knew it was a trap. She moved silently to the single window at the back of the room. It overlooked a narrow, bricked-in alley. The fire escape was outside a rusty contraption that looked barely capable of holding its own weight. She shoved the window up. It shrieked in protest, the sound tearing through the quiet apartment. She winced, freezing for a second, waiting for the front door to splinter open. Nothing happened. She hoisted the duffel bag out onto the metal grating, then threw her leg over the sill. The rain was freezing instantly, chilling her to the bone. She climbed out, pulling the window down behind her. The fire escape was slick with grease and rain. Camille gripped the railing, her knuckles white. She started down. 5 floors. 4. The metal groaned under her weight. Her foot slipped on the 3rd-floor landing. She went down hard, her knee slamming into the iron grating. A sharp, jagged piece of rusted metal sliced through her jeans, biting deeply into her shin. Camille bit her lip, hard enough to taste blood, choking back a cry of pain. She tasted copper and rain. She forced herself up, limping now, leaving streaks of blood on the wet iron as she climbed down the last 2 flights. She reached the bottom ladder. It was jammed. She threw her weight onto it, and it suddenly released with a deafening screech, dropping her the last 10 feet into the alley. She landed in a puddle, muddy water, splashing up to her thighs. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her duffel bag. "You shouldn't use those old stairs," a voice said. "They aren't up to code." Camille spun around. Under the dim, flickering light of a street lamp at the end of the alley stood 2 men. One was Thomas. She recognized him from the shop. The other was a man she didn't know. They weren't holding guns. They didn't have to. Thomas was leaning against the brick wall, casually smoking a cigarette. The orange cherry flared in the darkness, a tiny, terrifying beacon. Camille backed up her heel, hitting a rusted dumpster. There was nowhere to go. The alley was a dead end. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cracking. She tried to sound tough, tried to summon the cold-hardened girl she had been on the phone. But she was bleeding, freezing, and exhausted. She just sounded like prey. Thomas dropped his cigarette, grinding it out slowly with the toe of his expensive shoe. He stepped forward, the rain slicking his hair to his forehead. "Mr. Valenti wants a word," Thomas said politely. The politeness was the most terrifying part. "My car has heated seats. Please, don't make me carry you." Camille looked at the wet brick walls closing in on her. She looked at the blood running down her shin. She had run for 10 years, and she had made it exactly 40 blocks. She dropped the duffel bag into the mud. Part 4. The leather and the lint. The back seat of the town car smelled like armor, all stale rain and peppermints. It was overwhelmingly, suffocatingly clean. Camille sat rigidly on the far right side, pressing herself against the door panel. The heated leather was seeping warmth into her soaked, shivering muscles, but it only made her feel sicker. The contrast between her filthy, mud-caked boots and the pristine floor mats felt like a cruel joke. She was bleeding on his upholstery. A dark, wet stain was slowly spreading into the thick grey fabric beneath her torn jeans. She kept her eyes locked on the back of Thomas's head. He drove with both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2. He hadn't searched her for weapons. He hadn't bound her wrists. He had simply opened the door, waited for her to climb in, and tossed her sodden duffel bag onto the passenger seat. The silence in the car was a physical weight, pressing against her eardrums. The only sounds were the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers, pushing away the relentless city rain, and the low hum of the tires against wet asphalt. She calculated her options. The door handles were likely locked from the front. Even if she managed to unlock them, throwing herself out of a moving vehicle at 40 miles an hour onto a wet road would shatter her collarbone, maybe her skull. With a bad leg, she wouldn't make it to the sidewalk before Thomas stopped the car and dragged her back. Her right shin throbbed with a dull, heavy heat. The adrenaline that had propelled her down the fire escape was receding, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion. She looked down at the tear in her denim. The edges of the fabric were black with dried blood, but fresh, bright red drops still leaked from the center, sliding down her calf and pooling in her sock. It stung terribly, a sharp, biting pain that flared every time the car hit a pothole. "There's a towel in the armrest," Thomas said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any threat or sympathy. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. Camille blinked, pulling her gaze from her leg. She stared at the center console. She didn't want to move. Moving felt like a concession. But the blood was dripping faster now, fueled by the warmth of the cabin. Slowly, her frozen fingers numb and clumsy, she pulled down the leather center armrest. Inside the shallow compartment lay a folded white microfiber towel. She took it. It was incredibly soft. She pressed it against her shin, hissing sharply through her teeth as the pressure aggravated the torn flesh. She held it there, staring out the tinted window. The city blurred past an abstract painting of neon signs and streaking taillights. They were heading north away from her neighborhood, away from the harbour, toward the affluent, quiet districts, where the buildings had doormen and the streets didn't smell like rotting fruit. "Where are we going?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin, raspy from the cold and the screaming run down the stairs. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He took a right turn, the car gliding smoothly onto a tree-lined avenue. To wait. Wait for what? For him to decide. The finality in that statement closed around her throat. She gripped the bloody towel tighter. 10 minutes later, the car turned down a narrow private alley, sandwiched between two restored pre-war apartment buildings. A heavy steel garage door rolled up automatically as they approached. Thomas drove them down a steep concrete ramp into a subterranean parking garage. The air down here was dry and smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare. Thomas parked the car beside a sleek black SUV. He cut the engine. The sudden silence was absolute. "We're taking the freight elevator," Thomas said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Don't do anything stupid, Camille. I don't want to carry you, and I certainly don't want to shoot you in an enclosed space. The echo is a nightmare." He got out. Camille opened her door. The cold air of the garage hit her wet clothes, and a violent shiver racked her body. When she put weight on her right leg, the world tilted. She gritted her teeth, biting back a groan, and limped toward the heavy metal door Thomas was holding open. They stepped into an oversized industrial elevator, lined with dented steel plates. Thomas pressed the button for the top floor. The machinery groaned, lifting them upward. Camille leaned heavily against the cold steel wall. She felt lightheaded. The blood loss, the cold, the sheer terror. It was all compounding, blurring the edges of her vision. She closed her eyes, focusing on the smell of the damp wool of her coat. She needed to stay conscious. She needed to keep her wits. The elevator shuddered to a halt. The heavy door slid open with a metallic clatter. The space beyond was a massive open-concept loft. Exposed brick walls, steel beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the rain-swept city skyline. It wasn't decorated like a home. It felt like a staging area. There was a large leather sofa in the center, a massive oak dining table covered in rolled-up architectural blueprints, and a minimalist kitchen that looked like it had never been used. Standing by the windows looking out at the city was Nicholas Valenti. He had taken off his suit jacket. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the pale, jagged scars on his hands. He held a crystal glass with a single large ice cube and 2 fingers of amber liquid. He didn't turn around when the elevator doors opened. "Put her on the sofa, Thomas," Nicholas said. His voice carried across the empty room, low and resonant. Thomas nudged her forward. Camille limped into the room, her wet boots squeaking on the polished concrete floor. She didn't go to the sofa. She stopped 10 feet away from Nicholas, standing rigidly, the bloody towel still clutched to her leg. Nicholas finally turned. His eyes, that dirty, unreadable ice color, swept over her. He took in her soaked hair plastered to her skull, her pale, shivering face, the mud on her clothes, and the blood on the towel. He set his glass down on a steel side table. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. "I told you not to run," he said softly. "I didn't run." Camille lied her jaw tight to stop her teeth from chattering. "I fell." Nicholas stared at her. For a long, suffocating moment, he just stared. Then he let out a short, quiet exhale that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "Thomas." Nicholas said, his eyes never leaving Camille's face. "Bring the kit from the bathroom, then wait downstairs." Thomas nodded, disappearing down a short hallway. He returned a moment later, setting a white plastic tackle box on the coffee table. He walked back to the elevator, stepped in, and the doors closed, leaving Camille completely alone with the man who owned the city's underworld. The silence in the loft was different from the silence in the car. It wasn't empty. It was charged heavy with the smell of bergamot from his skin and the faint chemical bite of the scotch in his glass. "Sit down," Nicholas said. He gestured to the leather sofa. Camille didn't move. Her right leg was screaming a hot, pulsing agony that made her stomach churn, but she locked her knee. "I prefer to stand." "Suit yourself," Nicholas said easily. He walked over to the coffee table, unlatched the plastic box, and began pulling things out. A pair of heavy trauma shears, a bottle of brown iodine, a stack of sterile gauze pads, a roll of white medical tape. He didn't look like a mob boss preparing to torture someone. He looked like a weary mechanic sorting his tools. "Take off the boot," he instructed, his tone conversational. "I can do it myself," Camille snapped. She took a step back, her injured leg buckling slightly. Nicholas stopped what he was doing. He straightened up, towering over the coffee table. The soft, ambient light from the city below cast long shadows across his face, hollowing out his cheeks and darkening his eyes. "You are dripping mud and blood on a $20,000 rug," he said. His voice was perfectly level, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You are freezing. You are likely going into mild shock, and you are currently harboring the delusion that you are in control of this situation. Sit on the sofa, Camille. Take off the boot, or I will have Thomas come back, up here, and do it for you, while you are unconscious." The threat wasn't delivered with venom. It was stated as a simple, irrefutable fact of gravity. Camille swallowed hard. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She hobbled forward, sinking into the plush leather of the sofa. It was too soft. It made her feel trapped, swallowing her up. She bent down her fingers, fumbling with the wet, mud-caked laces of her left boot. She managed to pull it off, letting it drop heavily onto the floor. She reached for her right leg, but before she could touch the boot, Nicholas was there. He knelt on the floor in front of her. The fabric of his expensive dress trousers pulled tight against his thighs. He didn't ask for permission. He grasped her right ankle with one hand, his grip firm, warm, and entirely unyielding, and used his other hand to untie the laces. Camille stiffened her breath, hitching in her chest. She had spent a decade avoiding the touch of men like him. Men who took up too much space. Men who brought violence into a room just by breathing in it. He pulled the boot off, gently setting it aside. He reached for the trauma shears. "I have to cut the denim," he said. He didn't look up at her face. He just slid the cold, blunt edge of the scissors under the torn fabric at her knee and sliced cleanly down to her ankle. He peeled the wet, bloody denim back. Camille squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away. The wound was ugly. The rusted iron of the fire escape had gouged a deep, jagged trench across her shin bone. The surrounding skin was bruised a dark, angry purple, and the blood was thick and sticky. She braced herself for the sting, expecting him to pour the iodine directly onto the open flesh. Instead, she felt the cool, damp touch of a cloth wiping away the mud and surface blood around the wound. He was using a saline wipe, moving methodically, cleaning the perimeter before touching the injury itself. "You didn't ask me who called," Camille said suddenly. Her voice cracked. She needed him to speak. The quiet, focused way he was touching her was infinitely worse than if he had been yelling. "I don't need to ask," Nicholas said. He opened the bottle of iodine. The sharp, metallic smell immediately filled the air between them. "I know who called. I know why they called. I know the dialect you used to tell them to burn the cars." He paused, looking up at her. "This is going to hurt." He didn't wait for her to brace herself. He pressed a gauze pad soaked in iodine directly into the gouge. A sharp, breathless gasp ripped out of Camille's throat. Her hands flew down, grabbing his wrists to push him away, but his arms were like iron bars. He didn't budge. He held the burning pad against her leg, his face completely impassive. "Breathe!" he commanded softly. Camille dug her fingernails into his forearms. Her vision blurred with tears of pure white-hot pain. She cursed at him a string of foul, guttural Campanian insults that would have gotten her tongue cut out in her old neighborhood. Nicholas didn't react to the words. He waited until the worst of the sting subsided, then removed the pad. He grabbed a fresh one, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. "Your cousin Frankie," Nicholas said, his tone still terrifyingly calm as he held the bloody gauze against her skin, "has a gambling problem. He owes $60,000 to the Gallo family. The Gallos are not forgiving men." Camille stopped breathing. Her fingernails loosened their grip on his wrists. "Frankie didn't have the money." Nicholas continued wrapping a thick roll of white bandage around her calf, pulling it tight. "So he offered them a trade. Information. He told them he knew where the ghost was hiding. The girl who disappeared with the Gallo ledger 10 years ago." Camille felt the blood drain entirely from her face. The room spun. "I didn't steal it," she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. Nicholas tied off the bandage. He sat back on his heels, his hands stained with her blood and brown iodine. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of fatigue and cold calculation. "I don't care if you stole it, Camille," Nicholas said. "I care that the Gallos have been trying to push into my shipping lanes for 6 months. I care that they are looking for a ghost in my city. And I care that 20 minutes ago, 6 Gallo enforcers kicked down the door of your miserable little apartment." Camille stared at him, the horror slowly crystallizing in her mind. If she hadn't climbed out that window, if Thomas hadn't been in the alley, "You're dead." Nicholas said, his voice dropping to a harsh, quiet rasp. "Camille Hayes died tonight on a dirty mattress in a walk-up. The only reason you are currently breathing my air is because you possess something I want." He stood up, looking down at her battered, shivering form. "And you are going to give it to me." The bathroom attached to the guest bedroom was larger than Camille's entire apartment. It was a study in sterile, luxury charcoal slate tiles, a massive glass shower enclosure, and blindingly bright LED lights around the mirror. Camille stood under the scalding hot water for nearly 30 minutes. She kept her injured leg propped out of the direct spray, letting the heat soak into her freezing, aching bones. She scrubbed her skin until it was raw, using a heavy, unscented soap she found in a dispenser on the wall. She wanted to wash away the smell of the alley, the smell of the iodine, the lingering scent of Nicholas Valenti's bergamot cologne that seemed stuck in her nasal passages. She failed. The memory of his hands on her ankle, the clinical, unbothered way he had stitched up the jagged edges of her reality, clung to her. She turned off the water. The silence in the bathroom felt oppressive. She grabbed a thick heated towel from the rack and dried herself off. On the marble vanity counter, someone, probably Thomas, while she was distracted, had left a stack of clothes. A pair of soft black cotton sweatpants and a dark grey oversized cashmere sweater. She pulled them on. The clothes drowned her, the sleeves of the sweater hanging past her fingertips. They smelled of expensive laundry detergent and cedarwood. It was a suffocating kind of comfort. She limped out of the bathroom and into the bedroom. The bed was a massive king size, made up with crisp white linens. Her sodden duffel bag sat on the floor near the door, a pathetic reminder of her failed escape. The bedroom door wasn't locked. She tested the handle, expecting it to hold firm, but it turned easily. She pushed it open and stepped out into the short hallway that led back to the main loft space. The lights in the main room had been dimmed. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was a sprawling grid of orange and white lights, blurred by the relentless rain. Nicholas was sitting at the massive oak dining table. He had changed his shirt, replacing the blood-stained white one with a black Henley that stretched tight across his broad shoulders. He was reading a file, a pair of dark-rimmed reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked like an exhausted academic, not a man who commanded a small army of killers. He didn't look up as she approached, though her bare feet made no sound on the concrete. "There's tea in the kitchen," he said, turning a page in the file. "Or scotch. Given the night you've had, I won't judge either choice." Camille ignored the kitchen. She walked to the opposite side of the table, pulling out a heavy steel chair. She sat down, wincing, as her bandaged leg bumped against the table leg. "I don't have the ledger," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the panic she had felt an hour ago. The hot water had burned away the hysterics, leaving only a cold, hard knot of survival instinct in her gut. Nicholas paused. He took off his glasses, folding them deliberately and setting them on the table. He looked at her. Really looked at her. 10 years ago. Nicholas began his voice, taking on the cadence of a storyteller, reciting a grim history. The Gallo family kept their primary extortion and bribery records in a physical ledger. Old school. Paranoid about digital footprints. A smart move until a 17-year-old girl working as a cleaner in their front company managed to walk out the back door with it tucked under her coat. "It's a myth," Camille said, staring unblinkingly into his eyes. "A street legend. The Gallos lost it themselves and blamed a cleaner to save face." "Did they?" Nicholas rested his elbows on the table, steepling his fingers. "Then why did you spend a decade moving from city to city, using dead girls' names, flinching every time a car backfired? Why did you panic when your idiot cousin mentioned it on a burner phone?" Camille clenched her jaw. Her teeth ground together. "Because they believe the myth. And belief gets people killed just as easily as the truth." Nicholas studied her for a long moment. The rain lashed against the heavy glass windows behind him. "Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you are telling the truth. That you don't have the physical book." He leaned forward slightly. "You had it long enough to read it, long enough to copy it, or long enough to memorize the key players." "I was a kid." Camille fired back, her hands balling into fists in the oversized sleeves of the sweater. "I was a scared kid running for my life. You think I sat down and memorized account numbers? I think you are significantly smarter than you pretend to be," Nicholas replied, his tone chillingly smooth. "I think you spent 3 years working in a vintage horology shop, repairing microscopic gear trains that require a photographic memory and immense spatial intelligence. I think you remember exactly what was in that book." He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a printed photograph. Camille looked down at it. It was a grainy black and white surveillance still. It showed 3 men standing near the shipping docks. One of them was Thomas. The other 2 were older, heavy-set men wearing the distinct tailored coats favored by the Neapolitan syndicates. "The Gallos are pushing into the harbor," Nicholas said. "They are bribing the dock workers' union, undercutting my freight lines, and assassinating my foreman. They are trying to choke my supply chain." "What does this have to do with me?" Camille asked, though a cold dread was already pooling in her stomach. "They are operating with an insider's knowledge of the port authorities," Nicholas explained. "Someone on the city council is feeding them patrol schedules and customs manifests. The ledger you supposedly don't have contains the names of every public official the Gallos owned 10 years ago. Men who are likely still in power today." He tapped the photograph with his index finger. "You are going to give me the name of the councilman," Nicholas said softly. "You are going to give me the names of the judges, the police captains, and the union bosses that the Gallos kept on their payroll." Camille laughed. It was a harsh, brittle sound that scraped the back of her throat. "And if I don't, you'll torture me, you'll hand me over to the gallows." Nicholas didn't smile. He didn't blink. "I don't need to hand you over, Camille. I just need to open the front door. You heard me in the shop. You heard the dialect you used. You know exactly what they will do to you if they find you." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking slightly under his weight. "You are a ghost, Camille. But ghosts can't fight wars. They can only hide until they are exorcised." His eyes locked onto hers, heavy and dark and entirely unyielding. "You don't have a life to go back to. Your apartment is compromised. Your identity is burned. Your cousin is likely already at the bottom of the East River." Camille flinched. The casual mention of Frankie's death hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. "You are a liability to them," Nicholas finished softly. "To me, you are an asset. As long as you are useful, you will remain breathing." Camille stared at the photograph on the table. The edges of the paper were slightly curled. She felt the phantom pain in her leg throb in time with her racing heart. She looked around the massive, empty loft, the exposed brick, the cold steel, the impenetrable glass separating them from the storm outside. It wasn't a safe house. It was a terrarium. "So," Camille whispered the fight draining out of her, replaced by a hollow, cynical resignation. "I'm a prisoner." Nicholas picked up his reading glasses. He didn't put them on. He just held them, examining the frames. "You're a guest," Nicholas corrected, mildly, his gaze shifting back to the file in front of him. "A prisoner wants to leave. You, Camille, are a very smart girl. You know that leaving this building is the last thing you will ever do." Morning did not break in Nicholas Valenti's loft. It intruded. Camille woke to the harsh, unforgiving glare of a slate-grey sky pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She lay perfectly still on the massive king-size bed, staring at the concrete ceiling. For 3 seconds, she was just a woman waking up from a deep, exhausted sleep. Then she tried to bend her right knee. Pain tore through her shin, hot and jagged, ripping away the fog of sleep. She gasped, her hands immediately flying to her leg. The thick white bandage Nicholas had wrapped around her calf was still secure, but a faint, rusty bloom of dried blood had soaked through the center layers. It throbbed with a heavy rhythmic pulse, perfectly in time with her racing heart. The events of the previous night crashed down on her. The horology shop, the ringing burner phone, the rusted fire escape, the cold leather of the town car, the iodine. She pushed the heavy duvet off and sat up on the edge of the mattress. The oversized grey cashmere sweater dwarfed her frame, slipping off one shoulder. She felt incredibly small, frail and violently angry about it. She didn't want to leave the room. Leaving the room meant acknowledging the cage, but her bladder was full and her throat felt like it was coated in sand. She hobbled to the bathroom, favoring her good leg. After splashing cold water on her face, she stared at herself in the mirror. The bruising around her eyes was profound, deep, sickly shades of violet and yellow, born of exhaustion and stress. She looked like a ghost. Nicholas was right about that much. She walked out of the bedroom, leaning heavily on the doorframe. The main loft was quiet, but the air wasn't still. It smelled of dark roast coffee and something sharp gun oil. Nicholas was sitting at the kitchen island. He was dressed down today, dark denim and a fitted black t-shirt that left the scarred landscape of his arms entirely bare. A disassembled Sig Sauer pistol lay on a neoprene mat in front of him. He was methodically running a copper brush through the barrel. He didn't look up when her bare feet dragged across the concrete floor, but the rhythm of his brushing stopped. "There are eggs in the refrigerator," Nicholas said, his voice a low gravel rumble in the quiet room. "And coffee in the carafe. Thomas went out for bagels, but he won't be back for 20 minutes. Camille didn't go to the refrigerator. She walked to the opposite side of the island, keeping the wide expanse of white marble between them. She looked at the disassembled gun. The smell of the solvent was giving her a headache. "I don't want eggs," she said. Her voice was scratchy, raw. "I want a legal pad and a pen." Nicholas set the barrel down. He picked up a microfiber cloth and wiped his hands, his face impassive. He walked over to a leather satchel resting on a side table, pulled out a thick yellow legal pad and a heavy silver fountain pen, and slid them across the marble island. Camille caught the pad. She didn't sit. She leaned against the counter, taking her weight off her bad leg. She uncapped the pen. The nib was real gold. 10 years is a long time, she said softly, staring down at the yellow paper. Human memory isn't a hard drive. It degrades. It rewrites itself to cope with trauma. "I am aware of how the brain works, Camille," Nicholas said. He picked up the slide of the pistol, examining the internal rails. "It wasn't a book," she continued, closing her eyes. She needed to anchor herself in the sensory details of that night. If she was going to barter with her past, she needed to see it clearly. People always say, "the ledger." It wasn't a leather-bound book. It was a blue accordion file, frayed at the edges. It smelled like cheap cigar smoke and damp basement mildew. The papers inside were mostly loose leaf, handwritten. The handwriting was terrible, spidery, slanted to the left. Nicholas stopped wiping the gun parts. He was completely still listening. "I didn't memorize it," she said, opening her eyes to meet his. "I was 17. I was terrified. But I have a highly developed spatial memory. It's why I can rebuild a microscopic gear train without a manual. I don't remember lists. I remember geography." She looked down at the pad. Page 3, top right corner. A coffee stain shaped like a crescent moon. Next to it, a name written in red ink. Not black. Red. She pressed the gold nib to the paper. It glided effortlessly. She wrote a single name. Arthur Vance. Nicholas looked at the name. He didn't snatch the paper. He just tilted his head. "Arthur Vance," Nicholas murmured. "The zoning commissioner for the South Docks. He was pulling in $5,000 a month from the gallows to delay building permits for rival warehouses," Camille said flatly. "That was 10 years ago. I imagine his price has gone up." Nicholas picked up his coffee mug. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving her face. "Vance is a good start," Nicholas said. "But Vance doesn't order hits. Vance doesn't give them the patrol schedules for the harbor police. He's a mid-level bureaucrat." "It's a down payment," Camille replied, slapping the pen down on the marble. It made a sharp, echoing crack. "To prove I'm not a liar, to prove I have value, I'll give you one name a day, until my leg heals." Nicholas raised an eyebrow. The corner of his mouth twitched a millimeter of movement that might have been amusement. "You're extorting me, Camille." "In my own house." "I'm establishing a supply chain." She shot back, her chin lifting. "You're a businessman. You should understand. You get the whole list right now. I lose my leverage. I become disposable. And I refuse to be disposable again." For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the hum of the massive refrigerator. Nicholas looked at her, truly seeing the feral, desperate intelligence behind her bruised eyes. She wasn't shrinking from him anymore. She was cornered, bleeding and terrified, but she was showing her teeth. "One name a day," Nicholas repeated softly. He picked up the piece of paper, folding it neatly in half, and slipped it into his pocket. "Very well, Camille. We play your game. But understand this, if the gallows make a move, that a name on your list could have prevented your daily quota goes up. By the third day, the silence in the loft had changed texture. It was no longer the suffocating quiet of a hostage situation. It had settled into the heavy, measured stillness of a waiting room. Camille's leg was healing, but the bruise had spread, painting her entire calf in horrific shades of muddy green and black. She spent most of her time sitting at the massive oak dining table, the yellow legal pad in front of her. She had given him 2 more names, a police captain in the 14th precinct and a union steward who controlled the crane operators. Nicholas had taken the names without a word, handing them off to Thomas, who came and went like a well-dressed shadow. They did not speak much. They existed in an orbit around each other, 2 paranoid, exhausted creatures sharing a cage. It was late Tuesday afternoon. The rain had returned, drumming a relentless, depressing rhythm against the glass. Nicholas was standing by the window, staring out at the grey skyline. He had been on the phone for an hour, his voice low, clipped, and laced with a cold fury that made the hair on the back of Camille's neck stand up. When he finally ended the call, he didn't turn around. He just rubbed the back of his neck, the muscles in his broad shoulders knotted tight. "They hit a shipment of cobalt at Pier 4, Nicholas said to the glass. Bribe the harbour master to look the other way, while a private crew unloaded the containers into unmarked trucks. Camille stopped writing. She looked at his back. He looked incredibly heavy. Not fat, but dense, as if the gravity in his immediate vicinity was stronger than everywhere else. "Did you lose men?" she asked. It was the first time she had asked a question that wasn't directly related to her own survival. Nicholas finally turned. His face was a mask of sheer exhaustion. "2. Good men. They have families." He walked over to the kitchen island and poured 2 fingers of scotch into a glass. He didn't offer her one. He drank it neat, closing his eyes as the alcohol burned its way down his throat. "The union steward you gave me," Nicholas said, setting the glass down with a heavy thud. He confirmed the gallows are moving the cobalt through a shell company, but he doesn't know who is running interference at City Hall. The gallows have a phantom in the municipal government. Someone high up, someone who can override customs, manifests with a single phone call. He looked at her, his pale eyes pinning her to her chair. "I need the phantom Camille. Mid-level bureaucrats aren't going to stop this bleeding." Camille swallowed hard. Her fingers tightened around the gold pen. She knew the name. She had known it since the moment she woke up in this loft. It was the name written on the very last page of the blue accordion file, circled in heavy black marker. But giving him that name meant emptying her clip. It meant she had nothing left to trade. She looked away from him, her eyes landing on a heavy wooden mantel clock, resting on a side table near the sofa. She had noticed it on her first day. It was a beautiful piece, late 19th century French bronze and mahogany. But it was dead. The pendulum hung motionless behind the beveled glass. She pushed her chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the concrete floor. She limped over to the side table. "What are you doing?" Nicholas asked, his voice sharp with impatience. Camille ignored him. She reached out and opened the glass door of the clock face. It smelled of old dust and dried brass polish. She ran her fingertip over the elaborate, minute hand, then gently touched the pendulum bob. "It's a Brocot escapement," she murmured more to herself than to him. She reached around to the back of the heavy wooden case, her fingers finding the small brass access door. She popped it open. "Camille," Nicholas warned, taking a step toward her. "I don't have the patience for parlor tricks right now." "Shut up," she said. The command slipped out before she could filter it. It was the way she used to speak to impatient customers at the shop. Nicholas stopped dead in his tracks. No one told Nicholas Valenti to shut up. Camille didn't care. She was completely focused on the mechanical darkness inside the clock. She felt the suspension spring. It wasn't broken, it was just misaligned. Someone had moved the clock too roughly, throwing the delicate anchor out of phase with the escape wheel. "You have a paperclip?" she asked, holding her hand out without looking at him. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then she heard the rustle of paper from the dining table. Nicholas stepped up beside her. He didn't hand her a paperclip. He handed her a small, flathead precision screwdriver. He must have pulled it from the gun-cleaning kit. She took it. Their fingers brushed. His skin was warm. Hers was freezing. She leaned into the back of the clock. It was delicate work, requiring millimeter precision. She used the tiny screwdriver to gently nudge the crutch wire, shifting the anchor pallets just a fraction of an inch to the left. "Try to move an entire system at once," Camille said softly, her breath fogging the brass. "And you break the teeth off the wheel. You have to find the bind, the one piece of friction that's stopping the energy from flowing." She pulled the screwdriver out. She reached to the front of the clock, gently pulling the pendulum to the right, and let it go. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound filled the quiet loft, a steady, even, perfect heartbeat. Camille closed the back panel and shut the glass door. She turned to look at Nicholas. He was standing very close to her, looking down at her hands. The grease from the ancient gears was smeared across her pale fingertips. "The city councilman," Camille said, her voice barely a whisper against the ticking of the clock. "The one running interference. His name is Cole Harrison." Nicholas's eyes snapped up to hers. Shock, genuine and unfiltered, cracked his impassive mask. "Harrison." Nicholas repeated the word, tasting sour in his mouth. "He's the chairman of the Port Authority Oversight Committee. He's been eating at my restaurants for 5 years. He attended my sister's wedding. He was pulling 10,000 a week from the gallows a decade ago," Camille said flatly. "I doubt he suddenly found a moral compass." Nicholas stared at her. The anger radiating off him was sudden and terrifying, a cold, dark wave that made the air in the room feel thin. But the anger wasn't directed at her. It was directed outward, at a city that was decaying under his feet. He didn't say thank you. He just turned on his heel, grabbed his suit jacket from the back of a chair, and walked toward the freight elevator. "Nicholas," Camille called out. He stopped, his hand hovering over the call button. "That was the last name," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but she forced herself to keep her chin up. "That was the bottom of the file." Nicholas looked back at her over his shoulder. The soft light of the French clock illuminated the sharp planes of his face. "I know," he said quietly. He pressed the button. The doors opened, swallowing him whole, leaving Camille entirely alone with the ticking of the repaired clock. The loft felt like a tomb for the next 24 hours. Thomas brought her meals, sliding the plates onto the counter with grim efficiency before disappearing back down the elevator. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, and there was a dark smear of what looked suspiciously like dried blood on his cuff. The syndicate was at war, and the shockwaves were rattling the cage. Camille paced. Her leg still ached, a dull, persistent throb, but she forced herself to walk on it, refusing to let the muscle atrophy. She needed to be ready to run, because when the dust settled, Nicholas would have a choice to make about what to do with the ghost who knew too much. It was 2 a.m. on a Thursday when the freight elevator finally groaned to life. Camille was sitting on the leather sofa, her knees pulled to her chest, a heavy wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The lights were off. Only the ambient glow of the city illuminated the room. The heavy steel doors slid open. Nicholas walked in. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found it boring. His suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up. His knuckles, the scarred ones, were bruised a fresh, raw red. He walked directly to the kitchen island, bypassed the scotch, and poured a tall glass of ice water. He drank it in one long, continuous swallow, his throat working. He set the glass down and turned to face the dark living room. He knew exactly where she was sitting. "Cole Harrison is no longer the chairman of the Port Authority Oversight Committee," Nicholas said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual smooth baritone. "Is he dead?" Camille asked, her voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "No," Nicholas replied, walking slowly toward the sofa. "Dead politicians create investigations. Disgraced politicians create vacuums. I prefer vacuums. Thomas paid him a visit with a dossier of his offshore accounts and a very sharp knife. He will be submitting his resignation by sunrise, citing sudden health concerns." Nicholas stopped a few feet from the sofa. He sank into the heavy leather armchair opposite her, resting his elbows on his knees, letting his head drop for a second. "The Gallo supply lines at the docks are frozen," he continued, staring at the floor. "Without Harrison to forge the manifests, their cobalt is rotting in impound." The union steward suddenly remembered who signs his paychecks and ordered a strike on Gallo-contracted cranes. He looked up at her. The shadows under his eyes were bruised, identical to the ones on her own face. "You won," Camille said softly. "We stopped the bleeding," Nicholas corrected. "Winning takes much longer." He reached into his pocket. He pulled out 2 items and set them on the heavy wooden coffee table between them. The first was a thick, brown manila envelope. It looked heavy. The second was a black plastic burner phone. Camille stared at the items. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "There is $50,000 in the envelope," Nicholas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "And a fake Canadian passport. High quality. The name is Sarah Jenkins. The phone has 1 number programmed into it. A man named Bennett. He operates a private airstrip upstate. He is expecting a call at 4 a.m. to fly Sarah Jenkins to Montreal." Camille looked from the envelope to Nicholas. He was watching her intently, a predator completely at rest. "You're letting me go," she whispered. The words tasted foreign. "Unbelievable." "You gave me the friction," Nicholas said, gesturing vaguely toward the ticking French clock on the mantel. "You found the bind in the gears. I am a man who honors his transactions, Camille. You paid for your ghost." Camille reached out her fingers, trembling slightly. She touched the rough paper of the manila envelope. This was it. This was the door swinging open. She could walk out, disappear into the cold Canadian north, and spend the rest of her life jumping at shadows, waiting for the gallows to find her again. Because the gallows wouldn't stop. Not over a lost shipment. She looked at Nicholas. He looked exhausted. He looked lonely. He looked like a man standing at the top of a very high, very fragile tower, waiting for the wind to knock him down. "If I leave," Camille said, her voice gaining traction, the raw rasp hardening into something sharp. "The gallows will eventually find out who broke their network. They'll know Harrison didn't crack on his own. They'll look for the leak, and they'll eventually realize the ghost wasn't a myth." "You will be in Montreal," Nicholas said smoothly. "My men will ensure you are not followed." "And what happens to you?" Camille asked, leaning forward, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "You have a hole in your network, Nicholas. You found the bind, but you don't know how to rebuild the gears. You have muscle. You have Thomas. But you don't have anyone who can see the board the way I do." Nicholas narrowed his eyes. The ambient light caught the dirty ice color of his irises. "Are you offering me a job, Camille, after spending a week acting like a caged animal?" "I'm offering you a partnership," she shot back, her blood suddenly running hot. The cynicism that had defined her for 10 years evaporated, replaced by a sudden, terrifying clarity. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of living in roach-infested apartments and pretending to be dead. I know the Gallo network. I remember the entire file, Nicholas. Not just the names, the geography, the bank accounts, the shell companies. Nicholas sat perfectly still. He didn't mock her. He didn't laugh. "If you stay," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register, "there is no Montreal. There is no fake passport. You step into my world, you don't step out. You wear a target on your back for the rest of your life." "I already have a target on my back," Camille said, her jaw tight. "The difference is if I stay here, I get to hold a gun." She looked down at the coffee table. She picked up the black burner phone. It felt light, cheap, and entirely inadequate. She didn't call Bennett. She stood up, ignoring the dull ache in her leg. She walked to the kitchen island, picked up the heavy crystal Scotch glass Nicholas had used hours ago, and walked back to the coffee table. She dropped the burner phone onto the wood. Then, with a sudden, violent downward swing, she smashed the heavy bottom of the crystal glass directly onto the plastic phone. The plastic shattered with a loud, sharp crack, splintering into black shards. The motherboard sparked briefly and died. The silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the steady, even ticking of the French clock. Camille stood over the ruined phone, her chest heaving, the heavy crystal glass still gripped tightly in her hand. She looked up at Nicholas. Nicholas Valenti looked at the shattered plastic on his table. Then slowly he looked up at her. The exhaustion was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dark, intense, and profoundly dangerous heat. The corner of his mouth curved into a very small, very real smile. "Well then," Nicholas said, softly, leaning back in his leather chair. "I suppose I won't let you leave." That's the exact moment Camille stopped being a victim and became a player. Did you feel the shift in that final scene? The power dynamic completely flipped when she smashed that phone. If you loved the slow burn, the grounded tension, and a female protagonist who uses her mind instead of waiting to be rescued, you absolutely need to hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves dark, intelligent mafia romances, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories. Comment down below. Do you think Camille can handle Nicholas's world, or did she just make the biggest mistake of her life? See you in the next one.